Lucia stood at the gate of the house she once called home, her fingers tightening briefly around the handle of her purse before she forced them to relax. The building looked the same from the outside. White walls washed too many times, wide glass windows glowing with warm light, laughter spilling out as if nothing painful had ever happened inside those rooms. The irony did not escape her. Tonight, the house was alive again, not because it welcomed her, but because Carlos wanted to be seen. She arrived later than the invitation suggested, exactly as she intended. Being early would have meant waiting, shrinking, giving people time to look at her with pity. Being late meant control. It meant the room would already be full, eyes distracted, attention scattered until the moment she chose to step in. Inside, Carlos's voice rose above the others, confident and theatrical. He was playing the host perfectly, glass raised, smile sharp, every gesture designed to remind everyone that this house, this life, belonged to him now. Lucia could picture him without seeing him. He had always loved an audience. She took a breath, steady and quiet, and stepped inside. The dining room fell into a strange pause, and not silent, but uneven, as if the rhythm of the evening stumbled for half a second. Conversations thinned, forks hovered. Someone near the door whispered her name, unsure if it was real or imagined. Lucia walked in with calm steps, her back straight, her face composed. She wore no expression of defiance or sorrow. That version of herself was long gone. Tonight she carried something far more unsettling: indifference. Carlos turned slowly, irritation already forming on his face, ready to scold whoever had disrupted his moment. Then his eyes landed on her. For a fraction of a second the smile slipped. "Lucia," he said, recovering quickly, his tone light, almost amused. "I didn't expect you." "I was invited," she replied simply, her voice even, clear enough to carry without demanding attention. A woman stood close to Carlos, her hand resting possessively on his arm, younger, polished, dressed to be admired, the Mistress. She looked Lucia up and down with a thin smile that carried more curiosity than threat, as if she had expected someone weaker. Carlos laughed softly. "Of course you were. I just didn't think you'd actually come." Lucia nodded as if agreeing with him. People surprise each other. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. They knew more than they pretended. They had heard the stories after the divorce, the way Carlos spoke of Lucia as if she were an inconvenience he had finally solved. Seeing her here, calm and unbroken, did not fit the version they had been sold. Carlos gestured grandly toward the table. "Well, since you're here, make yourself comfortable. We're celebrating new beginnings." The words landed exactly as he intended. Lucia felt them, acknowledged them, and let them pass through her without reaction. She did not look at the woman beside him. She did not look at the house. She turned instead to the man who had entered with her. He stood slightly behind her, quiet, observant. His suit was simple but perfectly cut, the kind worn by someone who did not need decoration to announce importance. His presence drew curiosity without effort. Carlos noticed him then. "And you are?" Carlos asked, his brows pulling together just a bit. Lucia did not answer immediately. She stepped forward, choosing a seat near the table as if she belonged there. Only then did she gesture lightly toward the man. "A guest," she said. The response irritated Carlos more than silence would have. He hated gaps he could not fill. "Well," he said, forcing a smile, "any friend of Lucia's is welcome. Tonight we're all about honesty." The mistress laughed softly, looping her arm tighter around his. "It's good to finally meet you," she said to Lucia. "Carlos talks about you sometimes." Lucia met her gaze for the first time. There was no hostility in her eyes, no rivalry, just a quiet acknowledgement. "I'm sure he does," she replied. The table resumed its noise, but something had shifted. Lucia felt it in the way people glanced at her, then at the man beside her, then back to Carlos. The neat story they had accepted no longer sat comfortably. As plates were served, Carlos continued to perform, telling stories that painted himself as the victim of a marriage that had held him back. Each laugh he earned felt louder than necessary, each joke sharper, as if he were trying to bury something under sound. Lucia listened without interrupting. She did not defend herself. She did not correct him. That unsettled him most of all. At one point, he leaned back in his chair, swirling his drink. "You know," he said casually, "sometimes things end because they're mistakes from the start." Several guests went still. The implication was clear. Lucia lifted her glass, took a slow sip, then set it down. "Sometimes," she agreed. Carlos frowned. He had expected resistance. Tears, perhaps. Anger. Not agreement. The man beside Lucia remained silent, his gaze steady, taking in every detail of the room, every reaction. When his eyes met Carlos's, there was no challenge there. Only patience. As the evening wore on, whispers grew bolder. Someone recognized the man but could not place where. Another guest leaned closer, curiosity outweighing politeness, Carlos noticed. His confidence, once effortless, began to fray at the edges. He cleared his throat. "Lucia," he said a bit too loudly, "you never did answer. Who's your friend?" Lucia turned toward the man then, her expression softening just slightly. "Not for the room, not for Carlos, only for him." "He's someone who knows exactly who I am," she said. The words landed heavier than she intended, or perhaps exactly as she intended. Carlos felt it, though he did not understand why. A strange tension settled over the table, thick and waiting. Carlos opened his mouth to speak again, to reclaim control, to laugh it off. But Lucia did not look at him anymore. She sat calmly, unbothered by the house, the mistress, or the man who once believed breaking her was the same as winning. For the first time that night, Carlos felt something unfamiliar tightening in his chest. Uncertainty, and Lucia, quiet and composed, let it grow. Lucia did not need to look around the room to know the mood had changed. She could feel it in the way voices dropped half a note, in the way laughter arrived a second too late, in the way people kept glancing between her and the man seated beside her, as if trying to solve a puzzle without all the pieces. Carlos noticed it too. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his smile tightening as though it were being stretched beyond comfort. "So," he said, forcing ease into his voice, "how have you been, Lucia? I imagine life after divorce can be quiet." The word landed with intention, quiet, small, forgotten. Lucia met his gaze calmly. "Life changes," she said. "Some people grow with it. Others stay busy convincing themselves they've won." A few guests shifted, someone cleared their throat. Carlos laughed too quickly. "I like your confidence," he said. "It's new." Lucia did not respond. She turned slightly toward the man beside her, who had remained silent, attentive, entirely unbothered by the tension curling around the table. His composure contrasted sharply with Carlos's restless energy. The mistress watched the exchange closely now. Her earlier confidence had dulled into something sharper, more alert. She leaned in toward Carlos, whispering something that made his jaw tighten before he waved her off. Dinner continued, but it was no longer smooth. Conversations fractured. Guests leaned toward one another, whispering behind hands, curiosity spreading faster than the wine. Someone at the far end of the table stared openly at Lucia's companion, eyes narrowing with recognition, then confusion. Lucia noticed and said nothing. Carlos stood abruptly, raising his glass again. "Let's all relax," he announced. "Tonight is about celebrating progress, success, moving forward." He looked directly at Lucia as he said it. "Some people come into our lives for a season," he continued, "and some seasons end because they're meant to." The mistress smiled approvingly, squeezing his arm. Lucia set her fork down carefully. The sound was soft, but it carried. She looked up at him, her expression steady. "And some seasons end," she said, "because someone mistakes patience for weakness." The room went still. Carlos felt heat creep up his neck. He took a long drink to mask it, then laughed again, louder this time. "You always did have a way with words?" "Yes," Lucia replied. "I learned when to use them." The man beside her shifted slightly, folding his hands on the table. His presence felt heavier now, as if the room had finally begun to register him. One guest leaned closer, eyes widening in sudden realization, then quickly looked away. Carlos noticed that too. "Forgive me," Carlos said, his voice carrying a brittle edge, "but I still don't know who you are." The man looked at him calmly.
That's not unusual." A murmur rippled through the table. Carlos smiled tightly. "Well, you're in my house." The man nodded once. "For tonight." Something about the way he said it made the mistress straighten, unease flickering across her face. Lucia watched Carlos carefully now. She saw the shift before he did, the moment his certainty began to crack. His jokes landed less cleanly. His gestures grew sharper, more exaggerated. He interrupted others mid-sentence, desperate to pull attention back to himself. At one point, a guest leaned toward Lucia and whispered, "You look different." Lucia smiled politely. "I am?" The guest nodded, as if that answered something she had been wondering for a long time. Carlos slammed his glass down harder than necessary. "All right," he said, "let's not dance around things. Lucia, you come here unannounced."
"I bring a mystery guest, sit at my table and act as though nothing happened between us." Lucia looked at him evenly. "Nothing happened tonight. You invited me. I came." "That's not what I mean." "I know," she said, "but it's what I'm saying." The mistress finally spoke, her voice sharp with irritation. "Carlos, maybe this isn't the time." "No," he snapped, then softened quickly, placing a hand over hers. "It's fine." Lucia watched the gesture with detached clarity. She had once mistaken that touch for reassurance. Now she saw it for what it was. Control. Carlos turned back to her. "You always did this," he said. "Acted superior when things didn't go your way." Lucia tilted her head slightly. "I stayed silent when you needed an audience." A few guests inhaled sharply. The man beside her finally spoke again, his tone calm, measured. "You invited her here," he said to Carlos. "If you wanted applause, you should have rehearsed better." Carlos stared at him, disbelief flashing across his face. "And you think you can lecture me in my own house?" The man held his gaze without flinching. "I think you're confusing ownership with control." The tension snapped tight. The mistress pulled her hand away, standing abruptly. "Carlos, this is embarrassing." Lucia rose smoothly to her feet, not hurried, not defensive, simply present. "I didn't come to embarrass anyone," she said. "I came because I no longer avoid places that once hurt me." Her voice was steady, but the weight of it pressed down on the room. Carlos felt suddenly exposed. The walls, once symbols of his success, now felt like witnesses. Someone near the doorway whispered a name. Another guest's eyes widened in recognition, then flicked nervously toward Carlos. The man beside Lucia remained standing now, his posture relaxed, his presence undeniable. Carlos sensed the shift before he understood it. Something was happening that he could not stop. "Who are you?" he demanded again, louder this time. Lucia looked at him one last time, not with anger, not with triumph, but with something far more unsettling clarity. "He's someone," she said calmly, "you should have recognized sooner." The silence that followed was heavy, expectant, and filled with the sound of Carlos's confidence quietly collapsing. Lucia did not repeat herself. She didn't need to. The room seemed to contract around Carlos as the weight of her words settled. He felt it in the way the guests no longer met his eyes,
In the way several of them had subtly shifted their chairs away from him, as if distance might protect them from whatever truth was about to surface. "Recognize sooner?" Carlos scoffed, though the sound lacked conviction. "You're being dramatic." The man beside Lucia finally stepped forward, just enough to command the room without claiming it. His movements were unhurried, deliberate. He did not raise his voice when he spoke, and yet every word carried. "Carlos Rivera," he said calmly, "you signed 3 contracts last quarter without reading the final clauses." Carlos stiffened. "Excuse me?" "You were eager," the man continued, unfazed. "Eager to secure funding, eager to expand. You trusted the names attached to the paperwork instead of the details." A ripple moved through the guests. Business-minded ones leaned in now, alert.
Interest replacing discomfort. Carlos forced a laugh. And you think that concerns you? The man met his gaze evenly. It does, because those contracts now belong to me. Silence fell so abruptly it felt physical. Lucia watched Carlos's face change, watched the calculation begin, watched the denial crumble inch by inch. He searched the man's face again, really looking this time, pulling memory from buried meetings and forgotten introductions. No, Carlos said slowly, that's not possible. The man inclined his head slightly. My name is Mateo Alvarez. The reaction was immediate gasps, murmurs. Someone dropped a fork. One guest whispered Mateo's name as if saying it louder might invite trouble. Carlos's mouth went dry. Mateo Alvarez, the investor, the quiet force behind multiple acquisitions.
The man whose approval had opened doors Carlos hadn't even known existed. Carlos looked around desperately, seeking confirmation, hoping for contradiction. He found none. You, Carlos began, then stopped. His voice cracked. You're her partner? Mateo said calmly. Lucia stepped forward then, standing beside him, not behind. Her presence was steady, grounded. She did not touch him, did not cling. She didn't need to. The connection was evident without display. You used to tell people I was holding you back, Lucia said softly. Do you remember? Carlos swallowed. Lucia, listen. No, she said gently. You listen. The mistress stood frozen near the table, colour draining from her face. The house, the guests, the evening she thought celebrated her position, all began to feel unstable, as if they were sliding out from under her feet. Mateo continued, his tone still even. Your company's current valuation depends on my decision tomorrow morning. Carlos's breath came shallow. This is some kind of setup. Mateo shook his head once. It's a consequence. Lucia turned toward the guests. I didn't come here to make a spectacle, she said. But I won't apologize for no longer shrinking to make someone else feel tall. Several guests nodded, some with embarrassment, others with admiration. Carlos's voice rose, sharp and panicked. You planned this, you both did. Lucia met his eyes. You invited me. You brought your mistress into this house. You wanted an audience. She glanced around the room. You got one. The mistress finally found her voice. Carlos, she whispered. You didn't tell me. He snapped toward her. Not now. Mateo's gaze flicked briefly in her direction.
You might want to leave, he said politely. This conversation doesn't concern you. Her lips trembled. She looked at Carlos, waiting for reassurance that didn't come. Slowly she stepped back, humiliation settling over her face as the truth of her position became clear. Carlos turned back to Lucia, desperation breaking through his pride. We can talk about this privately. Lucia shook her head. For years you spoke about me publicly. Tonight is the first time you're being honest. Mateo took a step closer to Carlos, his voice lowering just enough to make the moment intimate and inescapable. You see, Carlos, I knew Lucia long before you lost her. I knew her when she rebuilt herself quietly, when she stopped explaining her worth to people who benefited from her silence. Carlos's hands curled into fists.
You're enjoying this. Mateo's expression didn't change. I'm correcting an imbalance. Lucia felt a calm settle over her, deep and unexpected. This wasn't triumph, it wasn't revenge, it was clarity. The room no longer held power over her because the story Carlos had told about her no longer existed. You said I was a mistake, she said softly, but mistakes don't walk away stronger. They don't build lives that no longer revolve around your approval. Carlos shook his head, pacing now, unraveling. You think you've won? Lucia considered the question. This isn't about winning? Mateo turned toward the guests. I believe that concludes the evening. No one argued. Chairs scraped softly as people stood, murmuring apologies, excuses, anything to escape the gravity of the moment. One by one they filed out, leaving the house emptier with every step. Soon only Carlos remained, standing in the center of the room that once made him feel invincible. Lucia paused at the doorway, looking back once. Carlos opened his mouth, searching for something to say, something that might restore the version of himself that had just collapsed. Nothing. Lucia turned away. Behind her, the house felt suddenly too large, too quiet, filled only with echoes of words that could never be taken back. Lucia stepped out into the night air, the cool breeze brushing against her skin like a quiet release. For the first time in years, her breath came easily. Behind her, the door closed with a soft, final sound, sealing away a chapter she no longer carried. Matteo walked beside her without speaking, matching her pace.
The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, stretching and thinning as they moved forward. The house loomed behind them, bright but hollow, a shell filled with noise that no longer mattered. Inside, Carlos stood alone. He wandered back into the living room, the silence pressing in from every side. The laughter that once echoed there was gone, replaced by the hum of the lights and the faint clink of glasses left behind. He picked one up, stared at the fingerprints smeared along the rim, then set it down again. The reflection staring back at him from the darkened window looked unfamiliar, smaller, exposed. The mistress lingered near the doorway, uncertain, her confidence stripped away. "Carlos?" she said quietly. "What's going to happen now?" He didn't answer right away. He couldn't. The future he had been so sure of felt suddenly unstable, balanced on decisions he could no longer control. "I thought," she began, then stopped herself. "You said everything was secure." Carlos finally turned to her, irritation flaring. "I said what you wanted to hear." The words hung between them, sharp and unforgiving. Her face fell as understanding settled in. She wasn't part of his victory. She never had been. "So what am I supposed to do?" she asked. Carlos looked past her, already withdrawing. "That's not my problem." She stared at him for a moment longer, then shook her head slowly. Without another word, she grabbed her coat and left, heels clicking sharply against the floor until the sound disappeared entirely. Carlos sank into a chair, rubbing his face with both hands. The house felt colder now, larger in all the wrong ways. Every corner reminded him of something he had dismissed too easily. Lucia's patience, her quiet strength, the way she had once believed in him when no one else had. Outside, Lucia and Matteo reached the car. Matteo opened the door for her, then paused. "Are you all right?" he asked. Lucia nodded. "Better than I expected." She wasn't shaking. She wasn't angry. What surprised her most was the absence of triumph. What she felt instead was relief, clean and steady. As they drove away, the city lights blurred softly through the window. Lucia watched them pass, each one feeling like a step forward. She thought of the woman she had been when she first left that house, carrying boxes and unanswered questions, wondering if she had failed at something that mattered. She hadn't failed. She had survived. More than that, she had grown. Matteo glanced at her. "You didn't owe him anything tonight?" Lucia smiled faintly. "I know. That's why it mattered." They drove in comfortable silence, the kind that didn't need filling. When they reached their destination, a quiet building overlooking the city, Lucia stepped out and looked up. The view stretched wide and open, nothing blocking it. Inside, the space was calm, intentional, free of echoes. Lucia moved through it easily as though she had always belonged there. She set her purse down, kicked off her shoes, and stood by the window, watching the city settle into night. Matteo joined her. "Tomorrow," he said gently, "things will change for him." Lucia nodded. "Tomorrow is his concern." She turned toward Matteo, meeting his gaze. "Thank you for standing beside me." He smiled, warm but restrained. You were standing long before I arrived?" Later, when Matteo stepped away to take a call, Lucia remained by the window alone. She thought about how often she had once measured her worth by someone else's approval. How small that world had been. Her phone buzzed softly. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. Carlos. She stared at it for a long moment, then turned the phone face down without reading it. Some conversations were finished, even if words remained unsaid. The city hummed quietly below, alive and indifferent. Lucia felt a sense of closure settle over her, not dramatic, not loud, but solid and real. She had walked into that house expecting nothing and left with everything that mattered intact: dignity, clarity, freedom. Lucia took one last look at the city lights, then turned away from the window,
ready for whatever came next. Not because she needed to prove anything, but because she finally understood she never had.